Right, and you're live.
Welcome to Grad Chat by PhD Balance, where we talk about topics of grad school beyond academic research and topics that might be a little bit more difficult to discuss in our day-to-day. I'm your host, Niba from Notes by Niba, and I'm a multimedia science communicator, which is basically a science content creator. I'm also the PhD Balance Ideals team leader. Ideals stands for inclusivity, diversity, equity, accessibility, and leadership. Before going any further, I would like to respect and acknowledge that I am on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, or forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place, and I recognize that I benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. So if you like what you see here, please be sure to check out our YouTube channel for more grad chats. We have a podcast as well. And don't forget to subscribe for notifications for when we go live. Today, we're going to be talking about self-advocacy as a woman in physics. I'm very excited to welcome our guest, Lipi Gupta, PhD. She uses pronouns she, her. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We're very excited for this because Lipi just defended her PhD in physics 10 days ago from the University of Chicago. Congratulations, this is very exciting. She's now headed into a software engineering focused postdoc fellowship at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Being a woman in academia and STEM and in research has a lot of its challenges, as we all might know. Self-advocating can be really complicated for, a multitude of reasons, societal pressures, the things that have been put on us, but it's absolutely necessary. But doesn't always mean it's easy. So Lipi is here with us today to share her experiences on this. So Lipi, can you tell us a little bit about just before we even get into it, your education journey and kind of why you decided to go to grad school?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think I sort of knew I wanted to go to grad school from a pretty young age. And the reason for that is because I'm a professor's daughter. So my dad has his PhD. And for us, it really was because my parents are both from India, and as immigrants, they wanted to make sure that my sister and I were set up for success in our lives. And the way that they had done that was, for my dad was to get a PhD. And even my mom has significant education. And so both of them really valued education and instilled that in us very early on. And so, I was fairly young when I had a pretty good understanding of what a PhD was and what it looked like. And so there was always this thought process of find something that you're really interested in and then commit to it for a very long time. And I luckily found that thing for me in high school. So actually in my first year of high school is when I got to take a class where we were learning about all different types of engineering. And somehow during that class, I learned about the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. And really what happened was, oh no, I think I can't hear you for some reason.
This is very impressive for a high school class, I just gotta say.
I know, it was well, and that's also has a lot to do with where I live. So I'm in a university town, and so we have a huge engineering department at the university here. So it's we have a lot of opportunities, a lot of access to things that people don't have in other places. So it is a very impressive thing for high schoolers to have access to. But yeah, and so basically what happened was we were talking about the LHC, the Large Hadron Collider, which is a huge particle accelerator in Geneva, Switzerland. And I basically didn't believe that it could exist. I was like, there's no way this thing exists. I was so skeptical. I'm very cynical. And it's sometimes funny because I even tell people, I think if I hadn't got into science, I could have gone way down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories. And so I'm kind of glad that I went okay, I'm going to learn about this and figure out how this thing works. And so really my mission from that point on was just trying to understand what are particle accelerators and how do you build a machine to do this. So my entire sort of undergraduate and graduate experience has been entirely about particle accelerators in particular, how are they built, how do they work, stuff like that. And so luckily that's a small enough interest that you can do a PhD in that. And so it kind of, worked out for me.
Yeah, certainly. Can you I know you mentioned like you had, professors or sorry, you had a dad who had his PhD and you
Yeah.
lived in a university town. Do you feel like that kind of like prepared you for grad school?
Yes, yes and no. I think, well, so here's one thing that I've reflected on quite a bit when I was in grad school was that I grew up in a house where my dad was a professor. So I knew what a committee was. I knew what it meant to get comments on your thesis and publishing papers or having a kind of relationship with your advisor where you can ask for help and, things like that. And so I was very lucky in that way that I had a set, some of the expectations of graduate school were sort of known to me already, which is not always the case. And I remember when I interacted with other graduate students in my program their families were not in academia, their family, they hadn't pursued any graduate school or anything like that. They didn't have the same, like, just sort of like background knowledge that I took for granted. And so it was a very important thing for me at that point to kind of reflect and be like, wow, I know a lot of stuff about the unspoken rules and the way things are happening in graduate school that not everybody will know when they arrive.
The hidden curriculum. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And even then, there are so many things that I don't know because in the end, every field is super different. And so the way and every university and every department is super different. So even if you have a pretty good sense of some of the basic stuff, like, the timeline that you have in your department for like getting a committee and submitting work and blah, 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 and what their requirements are going to be is going to be totally different than the way any other university does it or any other department. So it's yes and no. So like the specific stuff, you have to learn when you get to your department. And then, but the kind of bigger stuff, like even like what questions to ask, like even asking like, when do I need my committee? That's a question you need to have a sense of what is a committee? Why do you need one? Things like that. And that's not always something that's made clear to graduate students when they arrive. And so, yeah, I do think that I had a lot of, advantages in that way coming from the background I did.
Yeah, I think at the same time, it's interesting to have advantages and yet also not, as like, a person also with a intersectional identity. I'm really excited to kind of hear more about like your self-advocacy and where exactly this came up. Firstly, in what situations do you feel like you really had to advocate for yourself? Were there like specific instances where you were like, I need to push for this really hard right now? Or was it just kind of like a general from start to finish being a person in physics?
I think there are very distinct moments in which I needed to advocate for myself. And they're always at moments before significant transition happened, which I think makes sense. And that's not always the case, but that was the case for me. So when I arrived at University of Chicago, originally I was going to work with one professor on a very specific topic. And I made the kind of there's a lot. This is another one of those things that people talk about, but nobody actually ever, I think, really explains fully. Going to a graduate program with the sense of like, I'm going to work with this one professor who does this one thing and nobody else in the department does that thing is sometimes you're told not to do that because you might work with that professor for a year and then have a terrible relationship. And now you're not interested in anything else in the department. You're not interested in any other professor's work, and now what? And so I kind of did that. I mean, luckily University of Chicago has a couple of different professors working on different things. That said, again, there's not a lot of universities in the US right now that do particle accelerator physics as its own subfield. There's a lot of high energy physics, which is different. And so I did that. I went to University of Chicago to work with this one professor that does this one thing and nobody else works on that. And it's because I love that topic and I still do. And I'm a little sad that I ended up pivoting. I mean, spoiler alert, I did end up not working with that professor. But it wasn't anything dramatic. It was a very smooth transition. So I had a very good experience with when I did advocate for myself and say, hey, this isn't working for me. And I'll talk about what wasn't working. that professor, he told me, he said, go do good science. That's what he said to me. There was no bad feelings. There was nothing like that, because it really just came down to our styles not meshing at all. He's a theorist, and his mode of operation was to have a student go work on something for 6 years and come back, and you'll have everything, you'll have your whole theory and everything done. And I'm not like that. I'm a person that needs to be talking to someone daily, working with other people, very collaborative, like very, very involved type of work, and something that's maybe a little bit more applied. So I loved the work I did with that professor, but once I got to a point where I was just miserable. I mean, I would come home every day. I was driving to Argonne National Lab because that's where the professor, he mostly spent his time there. I was just sitting in an office. I didn't need to physically be there. That was another thing. Pre-pandemic, there was this idea that you had to go and sit in an office in a specific place to work, even if you didn't need to talk to anybody there. And that's what was happening. So there was social isolation happening. There was professional isolation happening. I didn't know anyone else in that office. It was later career scientists, and I didn't interact with them. And the work, while it was really interesting, was really hard, and I didn't have all of the access to help that I needed. And so at some point, and the order of operation here is what happened was, first I found another opportunity for myself. So I didn't, I wasn't willing to switch to a different professor or different funding or a different project, or, until I had found all of those things. And then I was able to go to the professor I was working for at the time to say, I'm not going to be able to do this anymore, and I need to go work on this other thing. And at the time, for me, that was what had to happen in order for it to not be the most terrifying experience of my life, because not having funding, not having a project, in graduate school, whereas there's this sense of like, I have to keep working towards this goal. And if I'm not working every second of every, week or whatever, I'm not going to say every second of every day, because obviously I didn't do that. But, if you're not working constantly, then you're, in trouble. And so at that time, that was the first moment I can think of self-advocacy. I planned everything, and then I went to the professor and said, hey, this isn't going to work out. And I found this funding, and I found this person, I found this project, and I'm going to go work on that. And so that's the first moment I remember. And that was already about a year and a half to maybe 2 years into my PhD that I sort of switched. I think it was almost 2 years into my PhD. But there was this sense of like, I need to change, and it's not going to happen unless I do it. And I think sorry, go ahead.
No, please finish your thought.
No, I was just gonna say that's when self-advocacy has to happen, is when that's the statement of, if I don't do something about this, nothing is going to change.
Yeah. Coming back to like the idea of self-advocacy more broadly, I think it can look very different for different people. So what would you say self-advocacy means to you?
For me, it is what I've described is just like speaking up and saying what you need. I had this cool opportunity at University of Chicago to take a class about like our emotions and dealing with emotions and stuff. And one of the things that we learned about in the class was how to ask for what you need and then deal with what happens afterwards, right? Because there's a lot of people who won't ask for what they need because they're so afraid that they won't get the answer they want. And so for me, it's not only learning how to ask for what you need in a way that's sort of constructive. You don't go in like crying and saying that you're miserable. It's like, no, you have to, maybe give some specific ideas of what's not working and then what would help, sort of like problems and solutions. At least in my case, that worked. I'm not saying everyone has to do that. No,
but I think you touched on a really good point there, that like it can be really overwhelming to just think about problems, especially in grad school, because it just feels like it's going on forever, and like it's very pervasive into just like every part of your life, because like you're working at work and it permeates your life in a way that like I think some jobs maybe don't. So if you think about solutions at the same time, it kind of gives you that like ray of hope. And at that moment, you might be like, oh, there's no solution to this whatsoever. But if you try and like, sit down, you're like problems and then solutions, at least maybe the solution is wild. Maybe it's like, leaving the lab and figuring out a whole new like place to go. And if that's what needs to happen, then that's what needs to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And I had a really nice mentor though, because I've had multiple times throughout my PhD where I was like, I'm just going to quit. Like the only solution is quitting. And, the nice thing he would say, he was like, that's always a solution, is to just leave. But let's think of other solutions as well. He was like, that's always going to be a solution, but it's not the only solution. And so what are some other solutions before that one? Because so he never said that's not a solution. He said it's just one solution. And I really appreciated that mindset of him not being like, no, don't quit, or, something like that. That's not what he was saying. He's like, yeah, in the end, if this is really something you don't want to do or you can't do, you can leave. That's fine. But let's also think of other ideas. And then I just wanted to say one other thing, I think in particular about self-advocacy is maybe a little bit different than advocacy. I don't know, like, just like generally being an advocate is, if for me in particular, when I had a problem, I do try to think of a solution because like, I know what is going to work for me potentially. And there might be a situation where I don't know what the solution is. But at least I might have a sense of like, if this was the way things looked, like I would function better, or I would be happier, or I would feel healthier, or whatever. And then you can brainstorm specifically what that looks like. And so part of self-advocacy is also saying like, I'm not doing well because of this. And I think a way to mitigate this issue is by doing this.
Yeah, that's a really great point. It's often, I think, people are very quick to advocate for like friends and colleagues and other people, and a little bit less for themselves. Why would you, speaking of academics specifically, why would you like kind of say self-advocacy is important for academics?
Well, I think part of it is because there is a lot of these like unspoken, or not unspoken, but there's a lot of like, I don't even know what the word for it. I want to say like stereotypes almost about what it's like to be in academia. So for example, there is this sense of like, oh, graduate students are just constantly working 24/7 all over the, on the weekends and everything. And so for example, when I went to Cornell, this was undergrad, Cornell is known to be like a pressure cooker. That's what people say. They're like, oh, everyone's always working all the time. And you have everybody's just like on the edge of mental breakdown. And I've had very stressful times at Cornell, but I never, ever did an all-nighter. Like I never pulled an all-nighter for anything while I was at Cornell. And the thing I tell people is, I chose to just not do that. Everybody was like, oh, I had so many friends who were just completely sleep deprived because they were constantly staying up to do things. And it's not, I was taking physics. I did a physics undergrad with a math minor. I was working a lot and doing a lot of classes, and I did research almost, a full credit, several credits worth of research. So I was busy. But for me at that point, it was like, I'm not going to give in to this thing that everyone is telling me I have to do, or that what it looks like to be a Cornell student. And so I think the same thing comes into graduate school. Now it's this, everyone in graduate school is constantly working all the time. And in my case, I was able to choose to not do that. Like there were definitely weeks where I was working a lot, but then there were certain weeks where I was like, I'm not working this weekend. I'm not working on Friday, and, it'll be okay. Like no one's gonna, call me out on it. And maybe that's because also my professor was the way she was after I switched from the other professor, things like that. But that was why I think self-advocacy in academia is a little bit different than in other environments, is because in some cases you do have the option to choose to take care of yourself in these little ways, if you can.
Yeah, I think one thing I notice with academia specifically is kind of the, we all know it's like not very structured. You kind of just like do what you want with your time, and you go to these meetings and seminars and blah, blah, blah. And at the end of that, like people can choose to work super hard and work weekends. And there were people I knew who went into lab like 8 days a week. And it's, I think that's part of why like self-advocacy in academia is so key, because like you don't have any structure. It's up to you to like decide what you're going to do. And maybe you have like, you might have a PI who's like very micromanagey and maybe like checks in on when you're in lab, or like walks around the lab to see who's there or whatever. But it's very, yeah.
I know. And that I've heard, honestly, I would call them horror stories. I've heard, and I've seen that myself at U Chicago. Even there were professors who, what I would say is that they don't model good boundaries. They themselves don't, I would say that they don't advocate for themselves by taking time out of the lab. And there are so many pressures. I understand that there's fundings and all this type of stuff, but I mean, I think another huge mission of mine in academia is to try to remind people like there's more than just this. Like, yes, we love our science and we do our science, but sometimes it is a job and we have other things in our lives that we can do too. And so modeling good boundaries when it comes to how much you're working, how much you're doing, how much you're asking other people to do, maybe that's a separate conversation, but I just feel like that's part of it. And then, then the other part of it being, and again, I did see this at U Chicago a couple times, people burning out and having to take time off. And the problem is that usually even when you get to the point of finally being able to ask for time off, you've already, exhausted yourself because you got to the point of burnout and then kept going for a month. And then you were literally like, I cannot function. I need time off. So another thing I would really recommend is if you feel safe enough and you feel brave enough, advocate for yourself before you get to that point. Don't even get to that point because it's miserable. This happened to me right before. This is the other most recent form of self-advocacy, was a couple months before I was actually supposed to defend. I was working so hard, so hard that I was beyond burnt out. And so finally, and it's interesting because before this, I had been telling my friends, like, I'm exhausted. I can't do this anymore. I need to tell my professor what's happening. And a lot of them asked me, they're like, okay, you could tell her, but what do you want her to do when you tell her? Because that's another thing is, and you can say, hey, I just want you to know this. Like, this is just information I need you to have, which is I'm exhausted, which most PIs would hopefully be like, okay, well then take time off. In my case, what ended up happening is finally when I got to that point, and I did go burn out, and then a month later, still even more burnt out, and finally emailed my professor and said, hey, I need a month off. Like I can't look at a computer screen. I can't look at my thesis. I can't look at anything. I need a month off. And luckily my professor, being the actually like superstar that she is, was like, yes, take a month off. Just put everything away and take a month off. And that was exactly what I needed, because afterwards I came back and I was doing great. So again, if you're able to get to, unfortunately, I'd like you to not get to that point, but if you do get to that point, please say something to someone and take the time off. I'm
really glad your professor had such a like positive reaction to you, standing up and stuff. What other kind of reactions have you gotten from people when you do self-advocate?
Well, so I have a very interesting anecdote that I thought about that I wanted to share, because I think it's a very powerful example of me observing self-advocacy happening. And I'm going to try to be very vague because I of course don't want to share anything too in detail. But what happened was I was TAing for a class at U Chicago, and one of the other TAs, we were in a situation where we were like what's called like a half TA. So we didn't have the same responsibilities as like the full TAs. But one of these other half TAs was being asked to do work that wasn't part of our hours for the position. And she, in a meeting, all the TAs were there and the professor and everyone were there, said this. She said, hey, I think I'm being asked to do more. And she had talked to me about this, and I had asked her, do you want me to say something? And she's like, no, I'll do it, which was great. Again, she wanted to advocate for herself, which was awesome. And the professor and the other like sort of admin person did not take this the right way. They were, in my opinion, very unprofessional, and they basically were accusing her of not wanting to do work. And they were saying that they were like, we're going to tell your professor that you're not doing the work that you told us you were going to do. And just like, I mean, like your worst nightmare type of situation when it comes to self-advocacy. So it was horrible. I mean, and she stayed so strong during that meeting, but at the end they were like, we're going to contact the chair. We're going to contact this person. Where like and all she was saying was, I'd like for us to do the like hours breakdown for the work that I'm being asked to do and see if it fits in my hours. It's like very academic question. Like I want to quantitatively determine that the hours I'm being asked to work actually or within the scope of how much I'm being paid, for example, right? And the answer could have been yes or no, right? Like they could have just done the calculation and been like, yes, it turns out this is in the number of hours and you should do it. And then she would have been like, great, now I know and I feel good about it and I feel fine. But they totally took this the wrong way. And so in that moment, that's when I remembered I've had very good experiences being able to advocate for myself, and not everybody has that experience. And for me, what it's done is it's reinforced that I can advocate for myself. And for another person, it probably has reinforced that advocating for yourself is not an option. One, it makes you afraid to do that ever again. And two, it makes you feel like you need to ask someone else for help. And while there's nothing wrong with that, I think it is really empowering to be able to help yourself at times, and to sort of have that experience and then take that away from that person, I think is really upsetting. So that was a terrible experience. Luckily, it got resolved very well in favor of the student. Nothing bad happened to her, and it was resolved. But first of all, nothing would have happened. And honestly, she would have been taken advantage of by this professor and this other person who were asking her to do more work than she was supposed to if she hadn't said anything. And in that moment, it was really, really scary for her. And luckily she had support. I mean, I was there, we were trying to sort of ease the situation and take care of everything. But she also had, not in the room, but afterwards, had a really good PI who was on her side, and the chair of the department, who is actually my professor. Yeah. So the chair of the department is actually my PI. And again, reminder, she's a superstar. So in the end, we had a good system of people who were really supportive of this type of advocacy. But that's not always the case. So I do want to just acknowledge that it can be really scary and it can go really wrong. And I saw it happen. But if you are able to, take away the positive from that experience of, if she hadn't done that, nothing would have happened and she would have had to do more work than she should have. And the next 10 graduate students would have also been taken advantage of in the same way. And so while it's not on any one graduate student to throw themselves in front of the bus of, power structures, in that case, her being brave and doing that really helped our department. Because the other thing that came out of this was the chair of our department made it very clear what the hours breakdown looks like. So now there's no question. Now everybody knows how many hours they can be asked to do certain TA work. And so I think, in that case, again, she may be really terrified to advocate for herself in the end, again, but I hope that, she's able to remember that even through that really scary, horrible experience, a lot of good came out of it. And she learned a lot of skills too, which is that she can advocate for herself. And so again, she's also, I'm using she pronouns because she does identify with she, her pronouns. And she identifies as a woman, I identify as a woman. It's really hard as a woman in a room of nobody else that looks like you, really. It just adds another layer of
explaining yourself and
should I be in this room? And I have a lot of experience now through my years of being in physics where I was the only woman in the room. Speaking up in those situations is so challenging. Like just reaching that level of bravery to speak up in a room where nobody looks like you, nobody has the same experience as you. It's not their fault. It's no one's fault. It's just is the way it is, or maybe it's someone's fault. But I'm, not the people in the room. They can be there. That's fine. But the other point of being was like, I also can be there, and I'm allowed to be there, and I'm allowed to speak up. And so there's, again, there's layers. So the first layer is being in the room and feeling comfortable in the room, and then the next layer is actually opening your mouth and saying something.
Yeah. You mentioned something about kind of like people to support you in these environments and places to kind of like, have that support. I want to add a little note that like a lot of times people don't feel supported, especially when they're going up against, a professor or someone who's got like a bit of a power imbalance there. And one thing that can be really helpful is talking to someone else who has that higher power. Like if you're having a difficult conversation with the professor, maybe you can talk to another professor about it, see what their advice is, see if they're willing to like come with you to this meeting. Even having like people on your side, so to speak, people who are also higher in power is one way to kind of like improve that like dynamic right there. Do you personally have different approaches for like how you deal with different people, like another grad student versus a PI versus like someone higher up in, I don't know, the dean?
Oh, totally. Oh, absolutely. Yes. In general, for people who I've had to sort of have difficult conversations with, if it's somebody who is closer to me in like the hierarchy, it's a little bit easier. So there have been postdocs who I've had to, sort of, again, also advocate for myself. It really happens every day. Now that I think about it, in some ways, I feel like it's always happening. I'm always sort of having to have it. And actually, one thing in physics, especially as a woman in physics, and it can depend on so many things. For example, your appearance. So I'm a person that likes to do my makeup and my hair. And for some reason, people associate that with not caring about your science enough. And I've heard this said to other women that if they spent less time on their hair and makeup, they'd have more time for their science, which is absurd because that's a whole nother podcast. But for example, there are times where I really have to remind people I am a physicist. I am a physicist, even though you, for some reason, don't think I am because you've never seen a physicist that looks like me. Every day I have to convince people that I'm a physicist. I
find it so mind-blowing that some people are like, out of the 24 hours of your day, how dare you spend 20 minutes on your hair and makeup? Like, I'm sorry, I can also work out, I can also cook. Like there's tons of things.
Yeah, I know. You probably spent 20 minutes just looking at your phone this morning. I spent it.
Oh my God, screen time.
Yeah. I know. Like I spent it on brushing my hair and putting a little eyeliner on. It doesn't mean I'm not doing my work. I don't know. Anyways, again, sorry, different conversation. But yeah, so again, you're I don't remember exactly what I was saying, but you're always advocating for yourself as a woman, and then so at the different levels. So for example, I haven't been in a situation where I've really had to have like, I think the hardest conversations I've had are the ones I've talked about, which is, wanting to switch PIs, which again, that one went really well because it was just like, hey, I found this other project I'm really interested in, and I'm gonna go work on it. And that professor was just like, cool, like that sounds like a great project, go do it. He was just really supportive of that. So in that case, it was something I could just go and talk to this person directly. But I have had situations where there are other, so for example, like postdocs when I was still working on my PhD, who were very helpful in being my backup. And they were like, hey, if you need to deal with this situation and you want to go talk to a professor or higher up, whatever, like I got your back. And they are in a higher position of power, and they're not in the same institution. So they have different power that I don't have. It is unfortunate being a graduate student, sometimes you're considered kind of like the bottom of the food chain in terms of this power dynamic. And so being able to find somebody who will back you up in the institution if you can do that, that's really helpful. And I have spent a lot of time at UChicago working with the different deans. I spent some time working with the Title IX office on how to make their services more accessible and stuff like that. It was like a student committee that worked on that. And I think people do get afraid of university administrations, or they think that they're just like out to get you or something, but the deans and administrative staff are a really good support system too. And they're there because they, sure, it's a job, but they do care about their students. And I've met a lot of so if you can't find someone in your academic field that, a postdoc, a senior graduate student, another professor, any of those things, look for a dean, look for somebody else who, maybe it's their job to help you out with this kind of stuff. And there are people at most universities whose their job is to help graduate students deal with difficult situations. And if you need that, it's worth at least finding out if that's a good avenue for you. And most of them, respect confidentiality. You can just go there and be like, hey, I don't know if I want to do anything about this, but I want to talk to you and see if you can help me or what you think I should do. That's something I do recommend.
Yeah. Ending on kind of a note of a kind of advice and tips, what sort of steps can someone who is new to self-advocacy take just to like start out? Are there like specific things you would try to do to like advocate for yourself in small situations? Because you don't necessarily have to go all out. So what's like a good place to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it. I think the place to start is with really small things. Sorry, that doesn't sound right. What I mean by really small things is not, usually things that seem small or that they should be small or something are things that really weigh on us too. So start with things maybe in your personal life. Start advocating for yourself when it comes to relationships in your life, or little things like, hey, this happened the other day and it was kind of frustrating. I think in the future, let's, make sure to communicate before we make plans, or, something like, that little moments of advocating with friends. Start with your friends, because again, I love my friends and all my friends are amazing, but there are definitely times where I haven't spoken up and said, hey, like, you were supposed to call me and you never did, I just let that go. And I'm like, that person's my friend and they care about me. I should have said something, and then it'll help our relationship in the future. So I think that starting small is a really good place to start. And I think the other thing is find your support system. Find the people who are always in your corner, or maybe not unconditionally, but at least the people who definitely have your best interests at heart, and bounce ideas off of them. Because another thing that happened for me was in the moments where I was like, hey, I'm going to say something to this person I've been having a problem with. I have a lot of friends who'll be like, okay, whoa, you need to restructure this. You need to think about, like, have you really considered the perspective here? And they've helped me workshop not only how, not to say that they're invalidating my feelings, but they're helping me really like boil it down to like, okay, here's what you need to do that will be constructive and not escalate the situation further, or something like that. Someone who isn't emotionally involved in the situation, but is emotionally involved in you, and they care about you. So find that support system and keep up with them. I know being in graduate school is really time consuming, but invest in those friendships, because that's what's going to keep you going through grad school. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So take it slowly and, invest time in those things.
Yeah. One thing I have been doing for the last like 3, 4, 5 weeks now has been figuring out like what my priority is in life overall. And one big one for me is working out, because I feel like it's like such a keystone habit that like makes other things fall into place much easier. So I've started like building my schedule entirely around my workouts. Like that is the one thing that I will not skip and not mess up on. And it's given me so much more energy, and I've done so many more things now. And like literally the other day, I like told this person I couldn't meet because that intersected with my workout time, and I was so proud of myself. Look at us.
Good. Yeah, that's great. That's like, it's not a little thing because for you it's super important, but it's little in terms of like you had control over that, and like, hopefully this friendship wasn't like, okay, well, bye. It was like just, okay, we'll meet another time. So that's really important. That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming here and joining us on Grad Chat. We really appreciate you coming here. For everyone who is listening, watching to this, all the links for connecting with Lipi will be in our description or in the description box, depending on where you're looking at. And that is all we have for you today. Until next time, I will see you